Stories of the Underground Railroad, gathered by the Historian Office of Monroe County in 1960, from persons who remembered stories told in their youth by people who had had actual contact with fugitive slaves.
My father, as I recall him, William L. Page, was one of the pioneers of Brockport. He was born in Florida in 1834, the youngest of 3 children, the other 2 being girls. At the age of 5, his mother died, and the children were all sent north to live and be educated. The girls were educated in a Catholic school in Baltimore, and the son was brought up in a Quaker family in Egypt, a small town near Rochester. When he was old enough to enter the University of Rochester, he did, and was the first colored person to graduate from that institution.
These next stories are told by Miss Gertrude Page, his daughter. She was over 90 at the time.
The complete history of the Underground Railroad, as it was called, probably never will be told, but there are many persons still living in Rochester and its vicinity who can remember something of its activities from their boyhood or girlhood days. Yes. Rochester was one of the busiest centers on the Underground Railroad. Some of the stations where fugitive slaves were hidden in their flight from the South to freedom in Canada are still standing in the older sections of the city. Many others, undoubtedly used for the same purpose, never will be known due to the habit of secrecy which operators in the system formed in the days when their liberty, property, and even life depended upon it. This intense secrecy, which prevented one member of a family from taking even his closest relative into his confidence in regard to underground activities, from keeping records or even knowing his associates in the system, always has shrouded the Underground Railway in mystery. Few accounts of it have been written, and with the death of those who remember the days of the fugitive slave, most of the information concerning it will pass out of existence also. Although societies for aiding runaway slaves were known to exist as early as 1786 from letters of George Washington written in that year, the Underground Railroad was not organized until after the passage of the first Fugitive Slave Bill, which made it a penal offense to harbor or assist a fugitive slave in 1793. Its operations did not extend into western New York until about 1837, but from that time on, the route from Albany through Rochester across Lake Ontario or the Niagara River became one of the most traveled in the network that extended through every state bordering on Canada. The name Underground Railroad was first applied to the mysterious system by southern slave hunters who found it there, to their dismay, that once a slave started on it, he was as completely lost as if he had disappeared underground. The fugitives were hidden during the daytime in the houses or barns of station agents, and at night either conducted or sent on their way to the next station. Turnings on their route were marked by a dead tree or limb planted at the crossroads, and sometimes signals to warn them of approaching danger were arranged. When the bloodhounds were used to track them down, their escape was not so easy, but there were usually sympathizers to help them cover their trail.
Miss Page's next story is an account written by an old man about something that happened when he was a very young boy living north of Palmyra, New York.
It was a moonless night in the late fall and nearing bedtime when a timid knock at the living room door caused silence amongst the youngsters. Father answered the summons. A huge colored man asked in a timid voice for a night's lodging. Father seemed to take the situation at once and invited him in, but the youngsters clustered around Mother in fear, not knowing what it all meant. His story was that he had a wife left in bondage. He was anxious to get to Canada, the land of freedom, where he hoped to earn money with which to purchase the freedom of his wife. He rested that night, and the next day with us. Mother gave him a good meal. Another dark night, after which they left for the Underground Railway at Lakeside. Father's farm team stood him in good stead for the long drive. At this station, the darky was to remain until the next night, when he was to be put aboard a boat for Canada, and was in the early morning when Father arrived home. At that time, boats came into the harbor at Putneyville regularly, and the conductors of underground stations were all posted on the times of arrival and departure, so that passengers were sure of meeting a boat without having to wait.
Another person who knew about those Underground Railroad stations near Pulteneyville was an elderly woman in Penfield, a Mrs. Cora Mead, and she tells about the place where she grew up.
Now, Camp Foreman went down there, was owned by Kyler's before it was made into Camp Foreman. And I lived down there in the house where the Underground Railroad was. And my brother and I, we went and looked for it, and we found it in the cellar. It was just like a big dungeon. And there was big heavy doors on there, and we went in there, and they claimed, Grandma Kyler claimed, that was where they used to hide the slaves. And they would bring them there, and at night And then they would signal them, and they would put them on the boat and send them across. Captain Troop used to be the one that would send them across over to Canada. And Grandma was telling that she had a lot of families there, and they were hungry and cold, and she used to feed them. And now the place is Camp Foreman.
Tell how the signals were sent.
Oh, well, there was a brick house. Now, well, we used it for a smokehouse. Of course, the place was all repaired over when we moved in and I lived there. And they used to have a bell there and a light. And when that light would go on, they would come in with the rowboats and load them up and take them over across.
I wonder if they have any idea of how many passed through there.
I don't know if they have or not. Oh, it's been so long ago. Of course, that was 100 years ago or more. Yeah.
Well, this dungeon place, you said, had iron bars for...
Yeah, there was bars there where they used to hang the lanterns on. And the door, I imagine the door was all the 6 foot deep.
Mm-hmm.
And it was iron halfway up. Of course, it was all rusty by the time we moved down there. It was just like a regular old dungeon, moldy, you know.
A scary place, wasn't it?
It was a scary place, but us kids wanted to find out what there was to it, so we went in. And how far it must have run out, I don't know, out at the outside of the house.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it was now the house was built and it faced right onto the lake.
Mm-hmm.
And Grandma Kyler used to sit in that chair that I've got out in the dining room right now.
Uh-huh.
And we'd go in there and she'd tell us the stories that would make our hair raise.
Now, do you remember any of those stories? No?
Not very much, because we used to go in there when we were looking for history. At that time, we studied history, don't you know? And we'd go in there and she'd sit there and she'd tell us about those slaves, boy. It used to scare us half to death. We couldn't hardly move.
Well, now, did she ever say that the sheriff would come
Oh,
looking
yes,
for,
they was looking for them.
Mm-hmm.
But they used to take them in the night, in the
Yeah.
dead of the night.
Mm-hmm. They never found any?
No,
Never arrested her?
no, I don't think so.
What religion was she? Do you know?
Yes, she was a little bit on spiritualist.
Oh. Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But
Was there clan or a group of them there in the
well,
hotel?
there was quite a lot of them there.
Were there?
The old settlers.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And there was Captain Troop's daughter. She married a miller. She was kind of a spiritualist.
Miss Page has an article by a Mr. Houghton, which she thinks will be of interest. And so let us listen now to Miss Page reading this article.
Case denies the marking and the modes of travel on the underground route are described at some length by Mr. Houghton, who says that it rarely extended into the slave territory due to the watchfulness of slave owners and hunters. The runway had to be made his way as best he could, usually setting his course by the North Star from his home to the border of some free state, and there someone would put him on the right line. Probably, says Mr. Houghton, the exodus of slaves would have been greater but for the fact that in some localities slaves were told that as surely as they went north they would be caught and frozen in huge blocks of ice, each block containing one or more Negroes, and those blocks would be piled up so that everybody could see them, according to the writer. Most of the fugitives came during the warm weather of summer and fall on account of having to be out nights. And as soon as the corn got high enough so that one could hide in it, the busiest time commenced. Much of the journey was made on foot, and sometimes over a route as long again as a direct line would have been, for the route had to go where they could be found were in sympathy with the movement. Over many of the divisions, conveyance would be provided, and the complicated routes were marked so that anyone who understood the marks could go any distance without once inquiring the way. One way of marking was by taking a limb of about 30 inches in length and sticking it into the ground close to the ground fence. The corner on which it was placed indicated the turn and also the distance which the turn was to be made. Whenever fugitives saw a signal near a dwelling, they knew that it was safe to stop there for rest and refreshment. There never was any trouble about sending dispatches north, for any of the fugitives who were fairly bright could be trusted to carry messages to their heads. Sending them south, as was sometimes necessary, was another matter, however. The United States mail could not be trusted, as it was frequently violated for the purpose of finding abolition papers, and so that was called message peddlers were employed. Some of our older readers will remember that many years ago an elderly man by the name of Thaddeus Finch used to travel through that section of the country, selling a few simple family remedies, flavoring extracts and so forth, entirely unsuspected. He carried many of the important messages from Canada line to points farther south. This system of verbal communication was known as the grapevine telegraph.
Miss Page was personally acquainted with Frederick Douglass, the great Negro abolitionist who made his home in Rochester in the period before the Civil War.
The matter of deep regret that so little has been written of the career of Frederick Douglass, for I know of none that could be used with greater profit in libraries and schools. It is not that he rose so high, but that he started so low. It was in the soul of Frederick Douglass to make the best of himself. It was his will that carried him up to the surface, where his natural gifts ripened in the light of opportunity. So the life of Frederick Douglass is one that may be studied with profit by others than people of his own race. Douglass first came to Rochester. He lived on Alexander Street, not far from East Avenue. Later, he removed to South Avenue on the hill near what is now Highland Park. When Mr. Douglass first came to Rochester, he found ready friendship and assistance, most of his constant supporters being Samuel D. Porter, Ariel Anthony, William C. Bloss, Joseph March, Mr. Post, Mr. and Mrs. Blackall, and people of that caliber. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was planned at his home. When the Civil War broke out, Frederick Douglass urged Abraham Lincoln to enlist Negroes in the army and emancipate the slaves. 2 of his sons were enlisted, and he rendered great assistance in forming 2 regiments in Massachusetts. He has served the nation in different ways. On the 20th, 1896, the suffrage convention convened in Washington. I was his guest at the time. It was held in Met-Strott Hall and was to continue for a week. Mr. Douglass, the initial speaker. That evening, when he reached home, as he entered the hall, he fell unconscious on the floor. I entered the hall a few seconds later and found him lying where he had fallen. The news spread slowly, as telephones were rare then, and the next day the convention recessed, and Miss Anthony and all the suffragists came over to express their sympathy. The funeral was a large one. It was at the Metropolitan Church in Washington. The auditorium seats 2,000. The galleries were filled, and the streets roped off the blocks.